In the dusty outskirts of Sweetwater, Arizona territory, where the sun beats down like a blacksmith's hammer and mercy comes as rare as rain in August, there lived a girl they called names that would make a preacher blush. But the cruelest name of all was the one that stuck like burrs on wool, Mule-Girl. Her real name was Clara Whitman, but nobody bothered with that. Not when it was so much easier to point and whisper about the girl who worked the mines like a beast of burden, who could haul ore carts that grown men couldn't budge, who never complained when the foreman loaded her down with twice what any soul should carry. They said she was built wrong, too strong for a woman, too stubborn for her own good. They said a lot of things. What they didn't say was how she'd gotten that strength, how she'd earned every muscle in her back pulling her dying father from a collapsed mine shaft when she was barely 14. How she'd learned to lift impossible weights because impossible weights had been dropped on her shoulders before she was old enough to know they could crush her. They didn't talk about the scars on her hands from digging through rock and timber, or the way she never asked for help because help had never come when she'd screamed for it in the darkness below ground. But this isn't just another story about a girl who got called names. This is the story about what happened when those names stopped mattering, when the very strength they mocked became the only thing standing between life and death in a canyon where hope had gone to die. You see, there are moments in every person's life when everything they've endured, every cruel word they've swallowed, every burden they've carried in silence suddenly makes sense, when the pain that broke them becomes the power that saves someone else. Clara Whitman's moment came on a Tuesday morning in September, when the earth opened up and swallowed a man whole, and the only person strong enough to pull him back from the edge wasn't the men who'd spent years laughing at her strength. It was the Mule-Girl herself. The morning started like any other in Sweetwater, with the kind of suffocating heat that makes even the lizards seek shade. Clara was already at work before sunrise, loading silver ore into the wooden carts that would roll down to the processing mill. Her hands moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd been doing this work since childhood, each motion efficient, purposeful, unstoppable. Around her, the other miners gathered in small clusters, sharing coffee that tasted like boiled leather and tobacco that burned like punishment. They talked in low voices about the usual things: silver prices, equipment failures, and women, always women. And when they ran out of other topics, they'd glance over at Clara and find something new to say about the girl who worked harder than any three of them combined. "Look at her go," muttered Pete Hawkins, spitting brown juice into the dirt, "like she's got steam pistons instead of arms." "Ain't natural," agreed Tom Bradley, the man who'd once tried to court Clara and been turned down flat. "Woman that strong, there's something wrong with her, something missing upstairs, if you catch my meaning." The laughter that followed was the kind that cuts deeper than any blade, but Clara had learned long ago not to flinch at words. Words couldn't cave in on you like mine shafts. Words couldn't crush your ribs or bury you alive in darkness. Words were just noise, and noise could be ignored. She kept working, muscles straining against the weight of the ore cart as she guided it toward the rail line. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the early hour, but she didn't pause to wipe it away. Pausing meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant hearing her father's voice calling from beneath the rubble, getting weaker and weaker until it stopped altogether. That's when the earth decided to remind everyone in Sweetwater that it didn't care about their petty cruelties or small-town gossip, that it had bigger plans for this particular Tuesday morning. The sound came first. A rumble that started deep underground and worked its way up through boot soles and into bone marrow. The kind of sound that makes horses nervous and dogs howl and wise men start running for higher ground. But the miners of Sweetwater weren't particularly wise, and they stood there for a precious few seconds trying to figure out what they were hearing. Clara knew immediately. She'd heard that sound before, in her nightmares and in her waking hours, the low growl of earth deciding to rearrange itself without asking permission. She dropped the handles of her ore cart and spun toward the source of the rumble, already moving before her mind had fully processed what was happening. The canyon wall, the one they'd been blasting for weeks to get at a promising silver vein, suddenly wasn't a wall anymore. It was a waterfall of stone and dirt and timber, cascading down in a thunderous avalanche that seemed to go on forever. Dust billowed up in choking clouds, blocking out the sun and turning day into a hellish twilight. When the noise finally stopped, when the last pebble had found its resting place and the dust began to settle, they could all see what the earth had done. Where there had once been a working mine face, there was now a jagged wound in the landscape, a gash that looked like God had taken a giant's shovel to the canyon wall. And somewhere beneath all that rock and debris was Jake Morrison. Jake Morrison, the cowboy who'd ridden into Sweetwater 3 days ago looking for work. Jake Morrison, who'd been standing too close to the blast zone when the warning shout came. Jake Morrison, who tried to run but hadn't been fast enough when the mountain decided to fall. The silence that followed the collapse was almost worse than the noise. It was the silence of men realizing they were staring at a grave, and that grave had swallowed someone they knew. Someone who might still be breathing under there if he was lucky. If luck was the kind of thing that mattered when half a mountainside had just rearranged itself. Pete Hawkins was the first to break the silence, his voice cracked and hoarse from the dust. Jesus Christ, where is he? Where's Morrison? The men spread out along the debris field, calling Jake's name, kicking at loose stones, looking for any sign of the cowboy who'd been there just moments before. But the pile was massive, a twisted maze of boulders and broken timber that would take a team of men with proper equipment days to clear. Days they didn't have, not if Jake Morrison was still alive down there. "We need to get word to town," Tom Bradley said, his face pale beneath the coating of dust. "Get some proper digging equipment up here, get organized." "Take 2 hours just to ride down and back," Pete replied. "Maybe 3 if the sheriff wants to round up a proper rescue crew." They stood there looking at each other, these strong men with their strong opinions about how things should be done, and for the first time in their lives they seemed small, helpless. The kind of helpless that comes when you realize all your planning and preparation means nothing when the earth decides to remind you who's really in charge. That's when Clara stepped forward. She didn't say anything at first. Just walked to the edge of the debris field and tilted her head, listening. The others watched her with expressions caught between confusion and annoyance. This was men's work, their faces seemed to say. This was serious business, and it required serious people to handle it properly. But Clara wasn't listening to their faces. She was listening to something else entirely, something the others couldn't hear over the sound of their own voices and their own fears. She was listening to the mountain itself, to the way sound traveled through rock and timber, to the spaces where air might still flow and life might still cling. And in that listening, she heard something that made her heart stop and start again. A voice faint as whisper, weak as candlelight in wind, but unmistakably human. Jake Morrison was alive. Clara pressed her ear closer to the rubble, her calloused palm flat against the largest boulder. The men behind her had fallen silent, watching with the kind of skeptical attention reserved for snake oil salesmen and traveling preachers. But she didn't care about their doubt. She'd learned to trust what others couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't understand. "He's there," she said, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk, about 15 feet in, maybe 20. "Pinned but breathing." Tom Bradley snorted. "How the hell could you possibly know that?" Clara didn't answer him. Instead, she began moving rocks, her hands finding purchase on stones that should have been too heavy for any one person to shift. But they moved anyway, rolling aside like they were made of paper instead of granite. The sound of stone grinding against stone echoed off the canyon walls as she worked, each boulder revealing the next, each cleared space opening up a path that only she seemed able to see. "This is madness," Pete muttered, but his voice carried less conviction than before, because even as he spoke, they could all see what Clara was doing, not just moving rocks, but moving them with purpose, with direction, like she was reading some invisible map written in the debris itself. The sun climbed higher, turning the canyon into an oven, but Clara never slowed. Sweat soaked through her work shirt, turning the faded blue fabric dark as midnight. Her hands began to bleed where the sharp edges of broken stone bit into her palms. But she kept digging, kept lifting, kept following that thread of sound that led down into the darkness where Jake Morrison waited. The other miners tried to help at first. They grabbed at smaller stones, attempted to assist with the larger ones, but Clara worked with a rhythm they couldn't match, an intensity they couldn't sustain. One by one, they fell back, becoming spectators to something they didn't quite understand but couldn't look away from. Hours passed, the sun reached its peak and began its descent toward the western rim of the canyon. Clara's movements never faltered, never hesitated. She worked like a woman possessed, or maybe like a woman finally free. Free to use every ounce of the strength she'd been mocked for, free to turn years of cruel laughter into something that mattered. Clara. The voice was so weak it might have been wind through dry leaves, but it stopped her cold. She pressed her face to the gap she'd opened in the rubble, peering down into shadows that seemed to swallow light whole. Jake Morrison, can you hear me?" "I hear you," his voice floated up from somewhere deep below, distant as starlight but definitely there. "Can't move my legs, something's got me pinned." Clara closed her eyes, calculating weight and angles, physics and possibility. The space she'd cleared was barely wide enough for her shoulders, certainly not wide enough for the kind of rescue the men would have attempted. They would have wanted ropes and pulleys, teams of horses, proper equipment that would take hours to organize and days to deploy. But Clara had something else. She had hands that had pulled a dying father from collapsed tunnels. Arms that had carried impossible loads without complaint. A back that had bent but never broken under burdens that would have crushed other souls entirely. "I'm coming down," she called into the darkness. "Girl, that's suicide," Pete Hawkins protested. "That whole pile could shift, could bury you both." Clara looked back at him, and for the first time in years, she smiled. Not the tight, careful expression she usually wore around the miners, but something genuine and fierce and absolutely unafraid. "Maybe," she said, "but he's dying down there while we stand up here talking about it." She lowered herself into the gap head first, using her hands and forearms to control her descent. The walls of her improvised tunnel pressed against her shoulders, threatening to catch her shirt, to trap her in the same tomb that held Jake Morrison. But she'd spent half her life in tight spaces, in mines and shafts where the earth pressed close enough to count your heartbeats. The darkness was complete now, thick as velvet and twice as suffocating. She could hear Jake's breathing, labored but steady, coming from somewhere ahead and below, could smell blood and dust and the particular scent of fear that clings to a man who knows he might die. "Keep talking," she called softly. "I need to find you." "Don't know what to say." His voice was closer now, close enough that she could hear the pain threaded through every word. "Never been rescued by no girl before." "Well," Clara grunted, squeezing through a gap that seemed designed to trap anything larger than a prairie dog, "there's a first time for everything." Her fingers found him before her eyes did. The rough fabric of his shirt, the solid warmth of living flesh beneath it. Jake Morrison was wedged beneath a beam that had probably saved his life by creating a pocket of space around him, but that same beam was now holding him prisoner in the earth's grip. Clara ran her hands along the length of the timber, feeling for weak points, testing its weight against her strength. It was massive, probably weighed as much as 3 grown men, pinning Jake's legs and lower body against the canyon floor. In the world above, this would have been impossible. No single person could lift such a thing, especially not in a space barely wide enough to breathe. But Clara had learned long ago that impossible was just another word for something nobody else was willing to try. She braced her back against the wall of debris behind her, planted her feet on either side of Jake's trapped form, and wrapped her arms around the beam. Every muscle in her body coiled tight as a spring, every fiber of strength she'd built hauling ore carts and lifting impossible loads focused on this one moment. "When I lift this," she said through gritted teeth, "you pull yourself out. Don't wait, don't hesitate, just move." "Clara, you can't possibly." "I said move." The world narrowed to just this. The weight of the beam, the strength in her arms, the determination that had carried her through years of mockery and cruelty. She lifted, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. The beam seemed welded to the earth itself, immovable as mountains. Then something shifted, not the beam but something deeper, something that had been sleeping in Clara's bones since the day she'd first been called names that weren't her own. The strength that came not from muscle alone, but from every insult swallowed, every cruel laugh endured, every moment when she'd been told she was wrong for being what she was. The beam rose, inch by impossible inch. It came up off Jake Morrison's legs, creating space where none had existed before. Jake scrambled backward, his legs useless but his arms still strong enough to pull him clear of the trap that had held him. Clara held the weight until she was certain he was free, then let it fall with a crash that shook dust from the walls around them. In the darkness, she could hear Jake breathing hard, could feel the warmth of his body nearby. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, "how did you do that?" Clara was quiet for a moment, catching her breath, feeling the burn in muscles that had just done the impossible. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something it had never held before, pride. "Same way I do everything else," she said, "one piece at a time until it's done." Getting Jake Morrison out of that hole took another 2 hours of careful maneuvering, of Clara going up and down the makeshift tunnel to clear debris and widen the path. By the time she finally hauled him up into the sunlight, the sun was painting the western sky in shades of copper and gold. The miners who had watched her descend into the earth now watched her emerge, and something in their faces had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like reverence. They stared at Clara as she helped Jake to his feet, supporting his weight until his legs remembered how to hold him. Jake Morrison stood there swaying in the fading light, his legs unsteady but his eyes clear and grateful. Blood caked his forehead where falling stone had opened a gash, and his shirt hung in tatters, but he was breathing. He was alive. And everyone in that canyon knew there was only one reason why. He turned to face Clara, this girl they'd all called names, this woman who just pulled him back from the edge of eternity with nothing but her bare hands and a will that wouldn't bend. When he spoke, his voice carried across the canyon like a prayer. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you for what you just did." Clara wiped the blood from her palms on her work pants, leaving dark stains that would never wash clean. She looked at Jake Morrison, then at the pile of debris that had nearly become his grave, then at the faces of the men who'd spent years making her feel small. "Don't need thanks," she said simply. "Just needed doing." But Pete Hawkins stepped forward, his hat in his hands like he was standing in church. The same Pete Hawkins who'd laughed the loudest when they called her Mule-Girl, who'd made jokes about her strength being unnatural, who treated her like something less than human for as long as anyone could remember. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time she could recall him using her actual name, "what you did down there, that wasn't human, that was something else entirely." She looked at him for a long moment, reading the confusion in his weathered face. He was trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed, trying to fit it into the small box he'd built for understanding the world. But some things don't fit in boxes, and some people are bigger than the names others give them. "Maybe," she said quietly, "or maybe human is bigger than you thought." Word spread through Sweetwater like wildfire in dry grass. By the time Clara made it back to the boarding house where she kept a small room, half the town had already heard some version of the story. The girl who worked the mines had pulled a man from certain death. The girl they called Mule-Girl had done something no man in town could have managed. But stories have a way of changing as they travel from mouth to mouth, and by the second telling, the details had already begun to shift. Some said she'd lifted a boulder the size of a church. Others claimed she'd dug through solid rock with her fingernails. The truth was impressive enough, but truth has always been too small for some people's appetite for wonder. Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion. Her hands were torn and bleeding, her back screamed with every movement, and her shirt was stained with sweat and dirt and Jake Morrison's blood. But underneath the pain was something else, something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Peace. For the first time since her father had died in that collapsed mine shaft, Clara Whitman felt like the strength in her arms meant something more than just another day's work. Like maybe all those years of carrying impossible loads had been preparing her for this moment, when carrying the impossible would save a life instead of just earning a few coins. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Sarah Caldwell, the doctor's wife, standing in the hallway with a basin of warm water and a collection of clean bandages. "Thought you might need these," Sarah said, her voice gentle as morning rain. "For your hands." Clara looked down at her torn palms, surprised to see them still bleeding. She'd been so focused on getting Jake out safely that she'd barely noticed her own injuries. Now, with the immediate crisis past, her body was finally claiming its due. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Caldwell, but I can manage." Sarah stepped into the small room without being invited, setting the basin on the wooden crate that served as Clara's table. "I'm sure you can manage most anything, dear, but sometimes it's nice not to have to." She took Clara's hands in her own, examining the cuts with the practiced eye of someone who dressed wounds before. Her touch was gentle but sure, cleaning away the dirt and debris that had worked its way into the tears in Clara's skin. "You know," Sarah said as she worked, "my husband delivered you the night you were born. Told me your mother was the strongest woman he'd ever attended, said you came into this world fighting, and you've been fighting ever since." Clara had never heard this story before. Her mother had died when she was barely old enough to remember her face, and her father had never been one for sharing memories that brought pain. "She would have been proud of what you did today," Sarah continued, wrapping a clean bandage around Clara's palm. "Using that strength of yours to save instead of just survive." The words hit Clara harder than any falling rock ever had. She'd spent so many years thinking of her strength as a burden, a thing that made her different in ways that invited cruelty. But sitting here in her small room, her hands being tended by gentle fingers, she began to see it differently. Maybe strength wasn't about how much weight you could carry. Maybe it was about choosing what was worth carrying in the first place. The next morning brought visitors. Clara woke to find a small crowd gathered outside the boarding house, folks she recognized from town but who'd never spoken to her before. They stood there hat in hand, shuffling their feet and glancing at each other like children waiting to recite lessons they weren't sure they'd learned correctly. Mrs. Henderson from the general store stepped forward first, clutching a wrapped bundle against her chest. "Miss Whitman, I brought you some salve for those hands. My grandmother's recipe works wonders on cuts and scrapes." Behind her, Tom Bradley cleared his throat and held out a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "Took up a collection," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Figured you deserved something for what you did, more than just thanks anyway." Clara looked at the faces surrounding her, these people who'd watched her work and struggle and endure for years without offering so much as a kind word. Now they stood before her with gifts and gratitude, trying to make amends for years of indifference with a few coins and a jar of salve. She could have taken their offerings with grace, could have accepted their sudden change of heart as genuine. Could have let them ease their consciences with small gestures and moved on with her life. But Clara had learned something in that dark tunnel beneath the earth, something about the difference between being strong and being respected. "I appreciate the thought," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the small crowd. "But I didn't pull Jake Morrison out of that hole for money or salve or any other kind of payment." She paused, looking each of them in the eye, letting them see the woman they'd overlooked for so long. "I did it because it needed doing. Same reason I've been doing everything else around here for years. The only difference is now you're paying attention." Tom Bradley's face flushed red above his collar. "Now see here, Clara, we're just trying to show our appreciation." "Your appreciation," Clara interrupted, "would have meant something 5 years ago when I was working double shifts to pay for my father's medicine. Or 3 years ago when I was hauling ore that grown men couldn't lift just to keep food on my table. Or any of the 1,000 days between then and now when you all acted like I was invisible." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, boots scraping against the wooden walkway. These were people who prided themselves on being good neighbors, upstanding citizens, the kind of folks who looked after their own. Except they'd never considered Clara to be their own until she'd done something they couldn't ignore. "But I'll tell you what," Clara continued, her voice softening just enough to let them know she wasn't entirely without mercy. "You want to show appreciation. Next time you see someone carrying a load too heavy for their shoulders, maybe offer to help before they have to prove they can handle it alone." She stepped back toward the boarding house door, then paused and looked over her shoulder at the assembled crowd. "And Mrs. Henderson, I'll take that salve after all, not as payment but as one neighbor helping another, the way it should have been all along." Jake Morrison came to see her that afternoon, walking with a pronounced limp but walking nonetheless. He found her behind the boarding house, tending to a small garden she'd carved out of the rocky soil. The vegetables growing there were stunted and sparse, but they were alive, thriving despite the harsh conditions through sheer stubborn determination. "Seems like everything you touch finds a way to survive," he said, settling carefully onto an overturned crate beside her. Clara continued pulling weeds from around the struggling tomato plants. "Just give things what they need and don't expect miracles. Most of the time, that's enough." "Most of the time," Jake agreed, "but sometimes miracles happen anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun track across the sky above the canyon walls. Jake flexed his legs gingerly, testing the limits of his recovery, grateful for pain that meant sensation, grateful for sensation that meant life. "I keep thinking about what you said down there," he finally spoke. "About doing things one piece at a time until they're done. That's not just about lifting beams, is it?" Clara smiled, a real smile this time, not the careful expression she usually wore around strangers. "No, it's not just about lifting beams. I've been drifting for 3 years now," Jake continued. "Ever since I lost my ranch to drought and debt. Been telling myself I was looking for work, but mostly I was just running from the feeling that I'd failed at the only thing I ever wanted to do." He gestured toward the small garden, toward the evidence of Clara's patient persistence. "But watching you work, seeing what you've built here with nothing but determination and time, it makes me think maybe I gave up too easy." Clara set down her weeding tool and looked at him directly. "What is it you really want to do, Jake Morrison?" "Raise horses," he said without hesitation. "Good horses, the kind that can carry a man through anything and bring him home safe." "Then that's what you should do." Easy to say. Hard to do when you don't have land or money or anything but a borrowed horse and the clothes on your back. Clara stood brushing dirt from her knees and walked to the edge of her garden where a small wooden box sat in the shade of the boarding house wall. Inside were coins, more than Jake would have expected someone in her circumstances to possess, saved penny by penny from years of backbreaking work. There's enough here for a down payment on some land, she said, holding the box out toward him. Not much, but maybe enough to get started. Jake stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Clara, I can't take your money. You saved my life already. That's more than any man has a right to ask. I'm not giving it to you, she said firmly. I'm investing it. In you, in those horses you want to raise, in the idea that sometimes good people deserve a second chance. She pressed the box into his hands, her torn palms rough against his skin. But I want something in return. Anything, name it. I want to help not just with the money, but with the work. I know horses, and I know land, and I know what it means to build something from nothing. She paused, then added quietly, and I know what it means to do it alone. Figured maybe we could do it together instead. Jake looked at this woman who'd pulled him from certain death, who'd endured years of cruelty with quiet dignity, who was now offering him not just financial salvation, but partnership. He thought about the strength in her arms, the determination in her eyes, the way she'd refused to give up even when the mountain itself seemed determined to claim his life. Partners, he said, extending his hand toward her. Partners, she agreed, shaking his hand with a grip that was firm and sure and completely unashamed of its power. That evening, as word of their partnership spread through Sweetwater, the whispers started again, but this time they were different. This time, when people talked about Clara Whitman, they didn't call her Mule-Girl or laugh about her unnatural strength. This time, they talked about the woman who'd saved a man's life with her bare hands, who'd turned years of mockery into mercy, who'd proven that sometimes the very things that make us different are the things that make us extraordinary. And in the growing twilight of a desert town that had learned something new about strength, Clara Whitman finally stopped listening to what other people called her and started answering to the only name that had ever really mattered, her own.